when you have the breaking down of a dominant political force, the courts start acting differently because they are not anymore part and parcel of a dominant governing elite, of which the courts are always part. But now suddenly, as a result of the domination breaking up, they are not part of the dominant elite anymore, making themselves much more free to actually give proper judgments in my eyes. And I think this is specifically what we are increasingly witnessing.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we have back with us Professor Koos Malan. Koos has been a state prosecutor, a magistrate, and is currently a professor at the University of Pretoria. He has authored numerous books, and the one I specifically want to talk about is Politiocracy, a critique of the coercive logic of the territorial state and ideas around a response to it. And I'll definitely recommend to anyone who wants to understand what is happening in South Africa today to go out and buy Koos's books, especially this one, because you understand the transition, what we're going through. So Koos, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Donald. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I enjoyed to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So Koos, many individuals might wonder how your book ties in with what is happening in South Africa today. But by explaining the past, one will understand what is happening, the transition South Africa is currently going through. And I mean, you'd probably use the term micro-republic. Someone like Dawie Ruet would talk about digital countries. Frans Colonial likes to talk about enclaves. But to set the stage, what was it like before the rise of the nation state? What was feudalism like?
Well, I think it's a very appropriate question because the most reliable indication of what might be awaiting us, especially also in South Africa, should be found actually in our own history. And our own history is a history not only of African communities or the communities who lived in Africa before, but specifically also our own European cultural and political history, going then back to medieval times, which is what you've touched on. Now, before the rise of the territorial state, I call it the territorial state, perhaps later on we can pay attention why that should be the appropriate designation. But before the rise of that, you had a vast array, a huge raft of smaller political units, kingdoms, republics, free cities, free to a lesser or larger extent, and an array of other smaller institutions, none of which was actually entirely supreme in the same way as the current state. The current territorial state claims supremacy. In other words, the government of such institutions, of such republics, micro-republics, free cities, and so on, had a tremendous amount of power still, but by far not the amount of power that a modern territorial state or the government of a modern territorial state would be claiming. A variety of other institutions within such institutions, within such smaller political units, actually shared the power with the governments of these republics, kingdoms, and so on, such as economic institutions, such as obviously the church, which in those days was a much more important institution as it is at the moment. Then obviously also a raft of civic institutions, which all had a much bigger say in the daily lives of the people involved. So there wasn't a question of complete supremacy in the sense that everything, all power, was actually claimed by a single government of a centralized territorial state as we have it at the moment. Now, the territorial state only arose first in England and France around about in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, centuries. And as a matter of fact, in other European states only later on. Germany, for example, and Italy, and I think that's common knowledge for our viewers, arose as territorial states only towards the latter part of the 20th century, of the 19th century. A modern state such as Austria, Hungary, and so on, were all part of larger empires in what was then called the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, in an era that predated the present territorial state. Well, then obviously also in Africa, and I think one has to say a word about that. In Africa, the state, as we currently know it, only arose as a result of the coming of the colonial powers. And in Africa, in most places in Africa, that only happened after 1870. It was as a result of the activities of the colonial powers, most important of which were Britain, obviously, France, and then also Portugal, Belgium, and so on. It was only as a result of the activities of those colonial powers that states, and specifically state boundaries, were actually demarcated in the way in which we currently know it in Africa. So before that, you had on a much more primitive basis, and I use that word on a calculated basis, it was much more primitive. But also in Africa, you had small primitive polities in kingdoms, in tribes, and so on, long before anyone thought about the rise of the territorial state. So in other words, the African state that we know at the moment, and which was left here by the colonial powers who left Africa towards the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, is purely the work, the activities, purely a result, an embodiment of the activities of the colonial powers. Before that, there were no states in Africa. And what has also been happening in Africa after decolonization is that many of those states have actually, to a large extent, deteriorated, as a result of which they might give the impression of territorial states, but where the states, the governments of those states in many territories that seemingly fall under the authority of those governments are in fact not under their rule, under their government, under their control, as a result of which you actually have a situation of statelessness in such situations. So the bottom line is that the modern territorial state is a purely historical phenomenon. There have always been polities. Let's use that general term. There have always been polities. In other words, politically organized communities with governments and so on, but which vastly differ from the territorial state, which we currently know as the most important mode of organization, mode of political organization. And this territorial state has come. It has made a big impression. It is playing an important role, but in many, many places, especially in what we normally would refer to as the third world, and that also includes specifically Africa, and more specifically also South Africa, and we're going to speak about that, I think, is under tremendous pressure to such an extent that it seems to me, especially also in South Africa, that it is in a process of making way for something that we can possibly surmise about, but which would vastly differ from the kind of territorial state in which all of us have grown up.
And Koos, taxation. I mean, you also raised the interesting point in your book about I mean, a king couldn't just simply say, okay, I'm going to charge you 10% more. I'm going to take 10% more this year. You couldn't simply just do that, like we're currently used to, and with the territorial state, where the government just says, we're going to take more this year. That it was a vastly different relationship with the central authority before the rise of the territorial state.
That's an interesting question. Actually, very good that you raise it. You see, there's a common misunderstanding that before the territorial state in feudal Europe, that you had at those stage kings, monarchs, who actually acted as absolutist rulers, who could do whatever they wanted to do. And that is vastly off the mark. That's entirely wrong. The phenomenon of absolutism, in other words, a monarch who could do whatever he wanted to do, only came to the fore in 16th and 17th century England for a very short period of time. It was only around the rule of Henry the Eighth, and possibly to a certain extent Elizabeth, his daughter, but actually also not. And then also it came to the fore in France in the 17th century. Well, a little bit before that. Well, basically in the 17th century, around figures such as Louis XIV and his successors. But over and above that, before that and after that, but most important to actually stress, before that, the notion of an absolutist king who could do whatever he wanted to do was completely unknown in Europe. Well, it was, I think, unknown all over almost. But let's speak about our own heritage, our own culture. It was unknown. I should also mention, very often people would say, well, in the olden days, as if the olden days referred to all times, you had the theory of the divine right of kings, and also that in terms of the divine right of kings, kings could do whatever they pleased to do. That is also wrong. The theory of the divine right of kings had a very short historical innings. After the Reformation for about 80 to 100 years, and after that it was gone. But okay, coming to the question of tax. The theories surrounding tax in medieval times can actually be encapsulated in what was later associated with the American independence movement: no taxation without representation. However, it is not a purely American phrase. As a matter of fact, it actually goes back to the medieval heritage. The idea was that a government mostly then encapsulated in the idea of the king with his advisors and so on, could only levy a tax on the basis of having summoned the Estates General in France, in Netherlands, and some other places, or Parliament in England with a parliamentary background, and only once Parliament or the Estates Generals have decided that a tax could be levied, only then could it happen. So levying taxes actually fell beyond the power vested in the king. There was no such thing. It's only a latter development. The idea was basically that the king has to take responsibility for his own well-being. The king's demands should be the basis, should be the source of looking after the king and broadly looking after the state, and not the citizenry, or then, if you want to use that term, although I think it's not very appropriate, the subjects. But in a sense, they were not subjects in the sense that they could not easily be taxed, as I've said.
And he also fought his own battles with his own soldiers. I mean, there's also this sort of idea that the king, if people have this idea, if the king declared war, he called the entire country into that war. But I mean, he only had his own personal fiefdom, and he could only traditionally call his own soldiers into that war.
Absolutely, to a large extent, that is true. The first country who was actually, I should say, the first state that was actually in a position to call an army, to summon an army, so to say, was the English king. In the 15th century for a certain period, in the 16th century for certain periods, the French king, and not to speak of all the other polities all over Europe, was completely incapable of doing that. They couldn't. The whole idea that sovereignty was an unknown factor in medieval politics actually also comes to the fore in this context. The only basis upon which the king could actually wage war and effectively wage war was on the basis of agreements that he had to enter into with the rest of the gentry, which might have cooperated with the king, but very, very often not. So no, there was not something like a general citizens' army. As I've said, from time to time, it could happen or it did happen in England, but the first time there was actually something like a mass army was the army of Napoleon in the era around about 1798 up to 1850. Not before that. That was a complete novelty at that stage, and that, as a matter of fact, accounts also to the victories of Napoleon. I do not want to detract from his strategic abilities and so on, but to a considerable extent, his success could also be described to the fact that he simply had the bigger army, a citizen army. Before that, it was unknown.
And what's also interesting, and I see directly this correlation with the African National Congress today, is that you mentioned in the book that the king spent a lot of his time going about the country, putting out fires, right, squashing revolts. And to a certain degree, you see the collapsing state of South Africa with President Ramaphosa going around trying to put out fires, and the moment he's gone, everything just flares up again. There's sort of that correlation between that and medieval times, where the king constantly had to quell revolts. Yeah,
I think that is absolutely true. That is so, especially in the earlier medieval period. That was in fact the case. The king was always traveling. He was always traveling around. But then an important additional thing that one should involve in the discussion in this context, Donald, is the fact that the king was also, so to say, the chief justice. So wherever there would have been disputes between individuals or between groups within his realm, then the king was, in the final analysis, the peacemaker, on the basis that he had to settle the disputes. Later on, for example, in England and in France, you had, and let's use the English example, you had the King's Bench. There have always been common law courts, specifically in England. But then, obviously, the king, the government also had a very keen interest in securing peace within his realm, within the boundaries of the kingdom. As a result of which, later on, various benches, amongst others the King's Bench, note the name, the King's Bench, was actually established. So the idea was, in the first instance, to keep the peace by doing two things: suppressing revolts, and also for keeping the peace through resolving disputes among the citizenry. Now, the reason why this is so important in this context, if you also look at South Africa in the present day era, you must look at the position of the condition of our courts, and you must also look at the condition in which the police services are finding themselves in, and the prosecutorial authority. Well, as we know, they are really, when we look at the police, they are really in tatters. We also know that the prosecutorial authority has huge problems. They are really incapable in many cases to bring simple prosecutions. Just yesterday, there was I read a report in the media last night of a case in Kimberley. And sorry for apparently going off the point for a moment, but actually we are at the point. We are precisely, it's very relevant to mention that. A Kimberley court had to deal with a case that was forthcoming from Postmasburg, where there were a lot of illegal miners engaging in mining activities, and where the local community approached the police in the first instance in order to take the necessary action in order to act against those illegal activities, which were also to the detriment of the community because it was disruptive and so on. The police didn't do anything. The court, eventually the community approached the court. The court in Kimberley granted an order instructing the police to do their work. It's strange, right? I mean, coming to think of it, just think of it. The police had to be instructed to be police. That's what the court had to do. Well, armed with their court order, the community in question went back to police and say, well, could you please act now? And then the police said, no, we're going to appeal this ruling. We do not want to do our work. And that's what it boils down to.
Wow.
So they applied for leave to appeal, and the case was before the High Court in Kimberley again. And then the judge, I just forgot his name for a moment, Judge Mafamale, I think it was, he said, look, how dare you ask me to do this? How dare you ask me to give you permission not to do your work? And then he went on to say, that is the reason why we have phenomena such as Operation Dudula. And he actually spoke positively about Dudula. Why we have Dudula who act against illegal immigrants and so on in lieu of government failing to do it. And then he went on to speak actually at length about AfriForum, who is involved in protection the country's borders at some places, involved also, and that's really the point why I'm raising it in the first place, why you have AfriForum who got involved and who is involved in prosecution as a result of the failure of the prosecutorial authority and so on and so forth. So here you have the court giving recognition, the court who actually has to, to stand in for state institutions. Yeah. But here you have the court giving open recognition in the open court. It is the report, there's reports on that, giving recognition to, they openly say so, to a variety of private and civic institutions simply taking over because they don't have any choice to do that, but to do that, simply taking over responsibilities which traditionally, at least for the past 300 years, have been associated with the state. So it actually also once again takes us back.
Who signed off on that? Who gave the order for, I don't know, the police captain or whoever to send this to the High Court to appeal this? I mean, what idiot did that?
Point taken that you call such person an idiot. But perhaps the phenomenon is perhaps you actually confronted here with a phenomenon. In other words, not only a single idiot, but a culture which has taken root within the police and within a vast number of other state institutions, which are in a position now where they are actually cherishing a culture of irresponsibility, a culture of not wanting to do our work, a culture of just saying, well, we assume now, we accept now that responsibilities associated with us are to be executed by other people. It is taken root. That's the reason why it's happening. That person who has signed off in that thinks that's the right thing to do. Let me just say the following in a few sentences. You're aware of my other book, There's No Supreme Constitution. I dealt in the book, amongst others, with the idea that the Constitution is not actually supreme, and that changes within the Constitution are consistently taking place. How are they taking place? Not through amendment of the Constitution, not through changing the wording of the constitutional text, or even through judgments by the courts, but simply as a result of political dynamics. What's the political dynamics? Well, the political dynamics, amongst others, is that you have a situation, as in this scenario, where the state has to do certain things, where the state has to execute certain responsibilities, in this case the police, where they on such a large scale fail to do so that they come to think that it's actually right not to execute those responsibilities, as a result of which those responsibilities just automatically migrate to institutions such as AfriForum, Operation Tudula, and a vast number of others. That's a constitutional change. It's not on paper, but it's there, it's happening. So this is precisely what you have here.
But Koos, if you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that the Constitution is essentially just a piece of paper at this point. I mean, there's no real guarantees that the Constitution provides us. I mean, Corneille Mulder likes to say, okay, we have a right. Okay, I don't specifically know that right off the top of my head, but a right to safety. I mean, it's guaranteed. But I mean, what does that right mean? If you were in KwaZulu-Natal last year, I mean, it means absolute bugger all. So if you're saying essentially it's a piece of paper, what do you think will happen to this piece of paper? Do you think the piece of paper will be changed, or do you think it will be burned? We will get rid of the piece of paper.
I think we will just forget about it. And I think, and the reason why I can off the cuff give such an answer is not because I'm predicting, it is simply happening. Just a brief philosophical point, if one wants to go into the nature of law always consists of, on the one hand, a norm formulation. We formulate that certain things should happen or should not be happening. But at the same time, that there's also a second element, call it a factual or a real element, and that is that people generally must actually act in conformity with that norm formulation. If we do not act in conformity of that, then it is precisely what it is, only a norm formulation, okay? Then it's only a piece of paper or only something that we are saying. And this is increasingly, but it's not law anymore. And this is increasingly what we are having in South Africa. And the question of safety and security is absolutely squarely in focus here. The Constitution states that the responsibility for internal safety and security is that of the police. Okay, there are many provisions on that, from section 198 up to section 200, 202, and so on of the Constitution. If one compares that with what is actually happening in practice, you see that there's a complete disconnect between the two, as a result of which the formulations are simply quietly falling by the wayside, in contrast with an actual law that has come into existence on the other side, an actual law of well-organized communities simply acting in a responsible way, thus looking after their own interests, their own safety, and in that way creating a new kind of law, a new content of law, without that necessarily being written down somewhere. But once people act in terms, once people takes up that responsibility and act in terms of that responsibility, and also enforce safety and security, that is actually the new law, albeit only the law in a particular area. You know, albeit only the law in the area where I or you live, or and only in a specific area. But in that way, you might have a variety of different small legal orders coming into place of the so-called supreme law that you find in the capital letter Constitution, which is simply falling by the wayside, of which this example of the police of Postmasburg is a telling example. But you have many such examples.
Yeah, and I mean, I said the guy's an idiot because here in the Western Cape, I was quite shocked to hear such a story. I can't even, we're used to somewhat different standards in the Western Cape. But
yes.
Koos, can't we use this piece of paper against it? Because, I mean, this piece of paper still has influence, right? I mean, it still has, in the short term, it still has, it's holding South Africa back. And can't we use a section like I've sent you this question? Can't we use a section like Section 10 in the Constitution? Every person has a right to human dignity. Can't a person argue this South African experiment, this centralization of powers didn't work, and we need to devolve powers, make explicit what's already implicit, I mean, you just referred to the judge that said, I mean, the civil organizations are really doing the job. Let's tell the judges to put this forward. I mean, to make a more federal system or a more confederal system, or argue that referendums should be held for independence, right? And put them in that box where they have to argue the South Africa experiment isn't working.
Yeah, I've listened carefully to your question, and I think there are actually two questions in one. In the first place, yes, I fully agree. We should utilize whatever constitutional provisions might be useful as far as possible. And as a matter of fact, many people, including many institutions, are in fact doing that. And there are many legal practitioners, attorneys, and advocates that are actually doing an excellent job in that field. If one looks, for example, at AfriForum, if we look at Solidarity and so on, they have pursued numerous cases. They have numerous cases in the labor law field, in relation to sports, in relation to local activity, local government, and so on, numerous, in which they were in fact successful, and in which the courts actually gave judgments in their favor and to the detriment happening. And I think the opportunities of doing that are actually increasing and not decreasing. Let me just say why. In this other book that I've referred to, There's No Supreme Constitution, I referred to an ideology, the dominant ideology which you have in South Africa. Perhaps I must put it in the past tense now, that you had in South Africa, the ideology of transformationism. I specifically call it transformationism. That's the idea of centralization as far as possible, and then also trying to create a kind of an homogeneous Africanist society, excluding the claims of any minorities and so on and so forth. The two actually go hand in hand, centralization and homogenization. Okay. Previously, the courts, including specifically the Constitutional Court, actually went out of their way to act as the judicial branch of the ideology of transformationism. I discuss in chapter 7 of that book a number of cases in which the Constitutional Court consistently gave judgment in favor of government. Okay, as a result of which the claim that the courts are actually independent and more specifically impartial is actually not valid. Now, people with, call it, general liberal constitutional conviction are normally very upset by that, but I cannot accept responsibility for them if they're upset by that. If you are upset as a result of your basic convictions being kind of disrupted by what is happening. But what is also happening is that it's an extremely interesting thing. Courts give judgments in those cases that I've mentioned, which are ideologically charged cases. Okay. When it comes to cases which are not so ideologically or politically charged, it's a different matter. That's one thing. Second thing is, when you have the breaking down of a dominant political force, the courts start acting differently, because they are not anymore part and parcel of a dominant governing elite, of which the courts are always part. But now suddenly, as a result of the domination breaking up, they are not part of the dominant elite anymore, making themselves much more free to actually give proper judgments in my eyes. And I think this is specifically what we are increasingly witnessing with, for example, a case like this. Moreover, that judge, and that is not to detract from what the judge has said in this case, and there are many other such cases, but that judge find himself in Kimberley or wherever he might be living in more or less the same position as you and me, perhaps me more in Pretoria than you in Cape Town, of having to deal with a crumbling municipal government, crumbling national government, a bad state of of security and safety. Okay, so he's confronted with the same kind of problems that the general public is confronted with, and he also kind of responds in the same way. He won't say it because judges are trained not to say what their personal convictions and experiences are. Okay, but that is in fact what is happening. So I think the breaking up of the dominant elite in South Africa under the ANC, which comes out in, for example, almost a kind of a consensus at the moment that the ANC would not manage to win the 2024 election with an outright majority. So against that background, the answer to your question is an emphatic yes. I think one should be making use of the courts. But that's the second part of the answer. I'll try to cut that short. In many, many cases, you don't need the green light, the approval, the thumbs up of the courts before you can do something. If you have to act in self-defense, you don't have to ask the court if you can act in self-defense. We recognize that you can act in self-defense, okay? And this is happening all over the country in relation to self-defense, but also in relation to numerous other functions, which are supposed to be executed by various state functionaries, various organs of state, but which simply are not executed by them, as a result of which you simply have the vast number of civic institutions and so on moving into the space vacated by government, and which actually start carrying out functions, well, governmental functions, which actually establish incrementally more and more self-government. That is what is happening. You don't have to ask the court. It's simply happening. A court might afterwards say, well, it's fine, but it need not, because it has already happened.
Koos, don't you think it's somewhat ironic that, I mean, you spoke about, I don't remember the precise term, transformationist or transformation. What's the term that you like to use?
I prefer transformationism. Transformationism, whenever you act the ISM, you're referring to an ideology and not merely a descriptive term, which transformation suggests to be.
Don't you think it's somewhat ironic that transformationism arose in a system that inherently, originally it was created to protect against? I mean, the legal system way back when was created to protect us from kings or dukes or members of the nobility who made summary and emotional judgments. That was why the legal system was partly created. Now, fast forward, we're using the legal system precisely for the it's sort of a catch-22 where we've gone back to using the legal system for the opposite ends where it was originally created for. It's now we're making emotional judgments, and that's it was created to protect us from that. Yeah,
that's a very sharp question actually to ask, and I think a very important question to ask. You see, in a culture where people normally are inclined to adhere to the law, where people are law-abiding, that kind of culture in which the two of us grew up, even though there might be a big difference as far as age is concerned, but that's the culture in which we grew up. There are a number of rules, and you act in terms of the rules. And if you don't like the rules, you could possibly challenge it, but you don't simply breach them. Now, you're actually right. Perfectly spot on. The idea of a constitution and the idea of rights in modern times, speaking of modern times, well, going back to the revolutionary era, last quarter of the 18th century, was to serve as a shield against a government that actually could go out of his way and encroach upon your interests. That actually already goes back to a previous era, 150 years or so before that, but that basically is what it boils down. Okay, government must, in a sense, provide protection. It must provide safety and security, but apart from that, we actually expect of government to stay out of our way. Government must not must not decide on moral issues. Government must not be a teacher. Government must not be a priest. Government must not be an invader into the cultural space, or the private space, or the religious space, and so on and so forth. It must not prescribe how civic relations should be organized. Okay, that's the call it conservative approach. In a sense, it is also a liberal approach in the sense that it seeks to protect individual claims, individual rights. But it's not only individual rights, it's also an attempt to actually defend the integrity of communities to look after themselves. Now, that is also the traditional view of the rule of law. What has been happening as a result of the emergence of socialism and a number of other strands within leftist philosophical thinking, especially also in South Africa, is no. The Constitution should serve not only as a shield, but it must be a kind of a sword. The government must be armed. Government must be given the necessary weaponry to vastly change the present bad situation that we have inherited from colonialists, Europeans, and so on and so forth. Generally, some people are quite open about it from whites, they would say so. Okay? So in other words, in terms of this approach, the idea is that the Constitution must not be an instrument to fend off encroachments and invasions into the private and civic fields, but must do exactly the opposite. It must enable government to actually invade and prescribe and to change vastly and fundamentally the present dispensation, because the present dispensation is shrouded in the most terrible sin that have been committed, that have been perpetrated by colonialists, capitalists, white supremacists, racists, and so on. So it's essentially utterly wrong, and it must be changed completely. It must be turned over in order to be replaced by a new society, almost kind of a new paradise. If you look into, for example, the South African interim constitution of 1994, the one that entered into force in 1993, entered into force in 1994. And if you look at the preamble, you see clear traces of that. You know, we have to say goodbye now to the very, very bad history that we've inherited. And I do not deny for one moment that many things in history was bad. Why? Why is that so? Because we're human. And that has to be changed. That has to be turned over completely in order to usher in a new paradisical society. If you look, for example, at the utterances of the previous Chief Justice, Mogoeng, and so on, you often find he said so. You know, there was this paradisical situation that was prevalent in Africa before the colonialists, and the main aim of the Constitution is to completely turn that over. So yeah, sorry, it's a very long answer, but you're spot on. This is precisely what what has been happening. Under the cloak of one and the same term, namely the Constitution and the idea of constitutionalism and the rule of law, two entirely opposite, diametrically opposite views are promoted. One seeking to protect, another one, well, to disrupt and turn around. Some people speak of disruptive constitutionalism, you know, openly. Some of my colleagues, for example. Yeah, which in the final analysis is not constitutionalism at all. It's another way of making war. So just to conclude that, that's precisely what they want to use the Constitution for. They see the Constitution as a weaponry, an armory that enables you to make war.
But Koos, I mean, they might cloak this in good intentions, but we both know that the top people in the Communist Party or in the Communist movement, what they're really trying to achieve is destruction of the judicial branch, because they know it's the chief opponent. They realize they can't really push things through or get things done if the judicial branch is there. And via cadre deployment or via transformationism, that's a way of getting rid of destroying and basically integrating the judicial branch into the central authority, central governing body.
Yeah. Two things, once again. In the first place, I think it is, and I think it's an important thing to get out of the way, to cast light on. It is generally incorrect to think that a judiciary is really as independent as and as impartial as the general doctrine would suggest. That is not so. Yes, judiciaries would be impartial in matters which are largely non-political, which are largely non-ideological. But once it comes to questions which are ideologically charged, a judiciary is nothing but one of the political branches. It just phrases itself in different terms. It uses legal phraseology. They wear legal gowns and so on and so forth. They sit on the bench. But in the final analysis, it's nothing but another form of politics. That's why some people quite correctly use the word lawfare. It's not warfare, but lawfare. You actually engage in war also through the judiciary. That is, to use two examples, why the appointment of justices in the American Supreme Court is a highly politically charged matter nowadays. That's why you have Dobbs, the case that was decided a month ago by the US Supreme Court, turning over Roe versus Wade. It's a political thing. Why did that happen? Well, because amongst others, the Trump appointments on the US Supreme Court bench. And in the second example, that is the reason why the appointment of justices to the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa and the High Court generally is also a highly contended political issue. Okay, precisely as a result of that. Okay, then the second part of the answer. The first person who actually articulated the idea of transformationism was an American lefty. Other people would, my lefty colleagues, some of them would speak much more highly of him instead of referring to him simply as a lefty, but I met the guy, I think he's just a lefty, was Carl Clare. Came to South Africa, visited South Africa on a couple of occasions, wrote an article back in 1998 on transformative constitutionalism, in which he openly said, well, no, look, everybody has to be involved in this great, wonderful, shining project of transformation, including the courts. The courts should not stand aside in this whole process. They should involve themselves. In other words, society should be changed through legislation, executive acts, as well as through judicial pronouncements. And after that, and I did discuss it on many occasions, I see some of the articles are quite often referred to nowadays also by some other colleagues in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, is that various judges, very foremost judges in South Africa actually explicitly said, no, the courts have to reconceptualize. South African courts should be reconceptualizing their own role. Dikgang Moseneke, who is normally very highly regarded, and I'll be the last person to say that he's not an intelligent person. I think he's very sharp. But that does not mean that he's not politically involved. He is very politically involved. And he explicitly said in various articles that the courts should actually be politically involved through what they are doing. They must rid themselves of their old conservative, and some cases you call them liberal attitudes. They should rid themselves of that. They should be part and parcel of the transformationist agenda.
That must probably be so frustrating. I mean, it's frustrating to me but it's probably also frustrating to you that it's been labeled conservative, that it's sort of been thrown in a political arena, the idea of just sticking to the rules, not making emotional judgment, but just sticking to the rules is a conservative idea.
Extremely conservative. Extremely irritating. Frustrating. Yes, it is. But that just underlines the point. One can be frustrated about that, and that should be the correct reaction, and the kind of normal reaction. But at the same time, they also betray themselves through saying so, because they are actually telling you to what extent they are openly in it, even though they might be judges. They don't leave you to guess what their agenda is. They actually tell you, precisely because they use these ideological terms, because they can tell you, they can say you're conservative, but at the same time they cannot, as a result of, on the basis of that claim, that they are somehow neutral. Not so at all.
Yeah, I understand your point, but the problem is, the average person doesn't see it like that. The average person now sees it as a battle between conservative or progressive judges, right? And why wouldn't you give the progressive judge the say, or why wouldn't you appoint progressive judges than these old conservative judges? They're deliberately framing it a political way to get more progressive judges or transformationist judges on the bench.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. But the way to respond to that is the following: the problem with ideological terms is that it's more a cover-up. It doesn't disclose. Come across that, and all of us actually know that. The term racism, for example, is not so is a racist. That's not the question. The question should be, what did that person do as a result of which is, from the leftist side, look, black people cannot be racist. It's impossible, because they have been subjected to previous racism, so they're just responding and defending. So the appropriate thing would be is just to ditch the whole term of racism and say, what have you done, Mr. White person or Mr. Black person? What have you done? And you don't call it racist or non-racist or something of that kind. You call it uncouth, ill-mannered, and so on and so forth. One must never involve yourself in this framework into abstract terms. One must always be as specific as possible. Then you're really making headway. Now, with the question of conservative judges, a conservative approach in contrast to a progressive approach, and so on. Progressive approach. This government being progressive. I thought progressive means you're actually making headway. You're progressing somewhere. They are not progressive. They are new primitivist, if you want to use that word. But also don't use that. Let's just ask, what are you doing? What have you done? And what is your view in relation to this and that and that? Being as specific as possible. In other words, avoid the evasive strategy of abstractions. I hope I've answered you.
Yeah, and definitely. I've reached the same conclusion. I've realized the best thing to do is to stop using those politically charged words. For example, just climate change, for example. Don't say you're for or against climate change. Just say, I want the environment to be cleaner. Who wouldn't be in favor of that? And I want realistic and practical routes to be done so that we can have a cleaner environment. What's wrong with that? And the moment you use those words, you're in a camp. You're either for, and then it's like it just shuts everyone's minds down. So you have to stop using those words.
Yes, precisely that. By the way, falling back for the moment on those terms. That is a good conservative approach, because a conservative approach would always be to say, let's go about incrementally. Let's deal with the facts. Let's not shout and scream and so on. Let's not be emotional. Let's look at what's happening here. What were the facts of this specific case, so that we can see, so that we can properly consider the merits of any encounter with which one must actions sailing under wonderful flags or very ugly flags.
Koos, I see our time is running out. I want to thank you so much for this super fascinating conversation. This has been so interesting. I want to give you one last opportunity if you want to plug something, or if you just want to answer a question that you'd hope I'd ask you.
Donald, thank you for the discussion. I think it is extremely important that we pursue this constitutional discussion. It's very, very important. We should remember, and I'm speaking here as I see nowadays people call themselves civilizationalists. Well, that's another abstraction, but let me embrace that abstraction for a moment. I'm not so much conservative or liberal or leftist or whatever. I am a civilizationalist, embracing and cherishing the heritage of Western civilization. Okay. Accepting responsibility for what we might have done wrong, which is absolutely not exceptional because people do wrong things, and at the same time embracing the most wonderful achievements of Western civilization, including the idea of law, constitutionalism, and so on and so forth. We have to cherish that, we have to embrace it, and we have to pursue it. And it's very important also in South Africa, where there's actually a huge ideological clash also, and also a civilizational clash, not so much between the West and Africa, but between Western civilization and what Western civilization stands for, including the idea of the rule of law and constitutionalism properly defined, against what is simply contra-civilizationalist, breaking down. And I think it's very important that topics such as this one that we have tackled today be discussed, and I hope we can pursue that further on. And lastly, congratulations with this YouTube channel of yours, which is clearly doing very well, and all the best and success with that. You're doing excellent.
Thank you, Koos. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And definitely, I mean, one can label it sort of the real progressives versus the anti-progressive. People who just want to take us back, regressive. But Koos, thank you so much to our viewers. You most certainly enjoy this content. If you made it this far, show your appreciation by liking this video, sharing it as wide as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.